Uh, First we have Max Anders on the theist side. Max is a philosophy graduate assistant for David Beck at Liberty University. He has BS in religion with a specialization in biblical studies and is finishing his MA in philosophical studies with a specialization in the philosophy of religion. His scholarly work includes 2 review articles on Molinism and divine providence, as well as 2 articles currently in the review process. One is co-authored with David Beck on God and multiverse, and the second is on Einstein's theory of relativity and its impact on theology. Max has lectured on logic, the various arguments for the existence of God, the multiverse, the problem of evil, and more. His master's thesis is on fine-tuning argument in light of the multiverse. He will be starting his PhD in the philosophy of science and physics next spring. He and his wife, Leah, currently live in Forest, Virginia. And joining Max, Josh Nixon. Josh is or is it Joshua? Joshua. Joshua is an international studies major from Culpeper, Virginia. He is a member of NLCF, which is... Gotcha. Joshua is a member of the Virginia Tech Interfaith Initiative, a fellow with Ask Big Questions at BT, and is studying Spanish and Arabic. Lovely to have both of you gentlemen here. And in this corner, we have, first of all, Dan Linford. Dan is presently a PhD student at Virginia Tech in physics, but is soon to join the philosophy department. I tried to warn them, but they accepted it anyway. Originally from upstate New York, Dan did his undergraduate studies at the University of Rochester. He runs the blog Liberare Cogitare e Ratio, and is a member of Free Thinkers at Virginia Tech. He has lectured on secular meaning of life, arguments about the existence of God, ideological competition, and his research in, and also lectured on his research in non-equilibrium statistical physics. That old thing. And joining Dan is Bo Bradley. Bo is an undergraduate biology major at Virginia Tech. He is a junior who is 25 years old, and before transferring to Virginia Tech from Northern Virginia Community College, was enlisted as a French linguist in the United States Army. Now, before we begin, how we'll proceed, I guess, is we'll have each member of the panel give about a 20-minute statement, and that will be followed by a question and answer period. But I was also asked to query, does everyone have one of the handouts from the theist side? If one is in need of a handout, I suppose they're around somewhere. Okay. So I guess you can if you need one. Also, before we begin, I'd like to give a few words of thanks to those who have made this event possible. The Leopard Zeus Fan Club, Free Thinkers at Virginia Tech, Liberty University Philosophy Department, Ask Big Questions at Virginia Tech, and all of you fine people who are attending. Also, I was asked to ask you about filling the questionnaires that were handed out the door. Please do so. I guess that would be very useful to various members of the board. And finally, this may betray some neutrality, but I was also asked to declare that there is a table with Richard Dawkins Foundation merchandise available downstairs. Okay. So with that, let's begin with our first first speaker, Matt Sanders.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in a discussion of one of the most important questions one could ever ask. My wife and I have always been impressed with this university. It's just a pleasure to be here. This evening, we will be defending the proposition, God probably exists. We will present three different arguments for this case. To defend our case, we will be using the prime principle of confirmation, which is whenever we are considering two competing hypotheses, an observation counts as evidence in favor of the hypothesis under which the observation has the highest probability. This principle is sound under all interpretations of probability. This principle, each argument must be taken on its own grounds, and admittedly, one cannot arrive at God at the end of each argument. A cumulative case, a conjunction of the arguments at the end, is what will get us to the conclusion that God probably exists. The first argument is the Thomistic cosmological argument. This traces back to Plato and Aristotle, and here as developed by Thomas Aquinas. Premise 1. What we observe and experience in our universe is contingent. 2. A network of causally dependent contingent things cannot be infinite. Premise 3. A network of causally dependent contingent things must be finite. Therefore, there must be a first cause in the network of contingent causes. In this context, what I mean by contingent is that if X is contingent, then X owes its existence to something else. For a thing that has the potentiality of movement cannot actualize its own potential. Some other thing must cause it to move. The universe consists of a network of causes. A was caused by B, but only because B was caused by C, and so on. We know of nothing that spontaneously initiates its own causal activity. Even supposed quantum indeterminacy requires antecedent conditions or causal state of affairs for the event to occur, such as the governance of the laws of nature. This is a hierarchical or a transitive network of causation. This is not temporal. Note that nothing here turns on our having to know about everything. Additionally, this argument stands completely independent of any principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason was later added by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Samuel Clarke to use the first premise as a universal claim. That's not the case here. It's inapplicable. Concerning premise 2, this network of contingent causes cannot go on into infinity. In such a series, the indeterminate causes have no power of their own, but are mere effects of their preceding causes. It doesn't matter whether there is an actual infinite set of contingencies, because such a set could not move from potentiality to actuality on its own accord. For instance, a train with an infinite set of boxcars cannot move without a locomotive. Also, consider David Hume's objection, stating that you can never get an infinite cause from a finite effect. Hume argued that if you could explain the subsets, or the boxcars, then you can explain the whole infinite set, the whole train. Paul Edwards follows Hume along similar lines. Edwards argues that each one in the series fully explains the one it depends on. However, in explaining the first member of a set, one must go outside of the set in order to have an explanation for it. An infinite series never gets out of the set. Thomas is willing to grant an infinite set of causes in fieri, or in process, but not in S causation, essence or being. That cannot be infinite. Premise 3 is the logical conclusion from premise 2. Thus, the reason that any contingent thing exists at all, and in particular the world of which we are a part, is that it is a contingent causal consequence of an absolutely necessary being, a being which itself could not have failed to exist. Only two things are possible explanations: abstract objects or minds. However, abstract Platonic objects stand in no causal capacities. The only option remaining is a mind. By implication, we remain with an uncaused cause, which must be spaceless, timeless, and transcendent. Thus, to ask the question, what caused the first uncaused cause, is nonsensical. Second argument is the fine-tuning argument. The fine-tuning argument argues that when the physics and the laws of nature are expressed mathematically, their values are ever so balanced in a way that permits the existence of life. This claim is made on the basis that the existence of vital substances such as carbon, the properties of the objects such as stable, long-lived stars, depend rather sensitively on the values of these physical parameters and the cosmological conditions. I'm merely arguing that the universe, or multiverse, is finely tuned for the essential building blocks and environments life requires for cosmic and biological evolution to even occur. Premise 1. Given the fine-tuning evidence, a life-permitting universe, or multiverse, is very, very epistemically unlikely under the non-existence of a fine-tuner. 2. Given the fine-tuning evidence, a life-permitting multiverse, or universe, is not unlikely under the fine-tuner hypothesis. Therefore, the life-permitting multiverse strongly supports a fine-tuner hypothesis over a non-fine-tuner hypothesis. Now, on the handouts, that square is not a necessity modal quantifier. That's supposed to be a much, much less than symbol. Now remember, K prime here represents some appropriately chosen background information that does not include the other arguments for the existence of God. These are taken on independent backgrounds. The argument is valid since the conclusion follows from the premises. So I think that the fine-tuning evidence is very, very unlikely under a non-fine-tuner hypothesis. Well, single universe scenarios require the fine-tuning of the laws of nature, the fundamental constants, the initial conditions of the Big Bang in order for life to exist. The list of necessary parameters is quite extensive, such as the fine-tuning of the strong and weak nuclear forces, the electromagnetic force, the cosmological constant, etc. However, the most common reaction to the fine-tuning argument is to appeal to one of 4 different types of multiverse scenarios, 3 of which of those suggest that our Hubble volume, our universe, is one amongst countless others in the sea of universes with different physics. However, these multiverse scenarios require just as much of an explanation as a single universe. The inflationary superstring multiverse scenario can only produce life-sustaining universes because it has the following 4 components. The first is a mechanism to supply the energy needed to form the bubbles. This is the fine-tuning of the inflation field. The second is a mechanism to form the bubbles. This is Einstein's field equations with a fine-tuning and coupling of the inflation field. The inflation field that gives empty space a positive energy density is needed to achieve these first 2 components. Without either factor, there would neither be regions of space that inflate, nor would those regions have the mass energy necessary for the universe to exist. If, for example, the universe obeyed Newton's theory of gravity instead of Einstein's, the vacuum energy of the inflation field would at best simply create gravitational attraction, not expansion. The third component is a mechanism to convert the energy of the inflation field to the normal mass energy we find in our universe. The conversion of the energy of the inflation field to the normal mass energy of our universe is achieved by Einstein's equivalence of mass and energy, the famous E equals mc squared, along with the assumption that there's a coupling between the inflation field and the matter fields. The fourth mechanism is one that allows enough variation in the constants of physics among the universes. After all, one of the predictions of quantum cosmology is random constants. This mechanism would be superstring theory, or M theory. Although some of the laws of physics can vary from universe to universe in M theory, these fundamental laws and principles underlie M theory and therefore cannot be explained as a product of the multiverse selection. Further, since the variation among universes would consist of variation of the masses and types of particles that form the forces between them, complex structures would almost certainly not be atom-like, and stable energy sources would almost certainly require aggregates of matter. Thus, the said fundamental laws seem necessary for there to be life in many of the universes, not merely in any universe with our specific types of particles and forces. In defense of premise 2, the best scientific evidence does suggest fine-tuning. The fine-tuning hypothesis is a religiously neutral position. The question is whether it is more reasonable to infer the existence of a fine-tuning to produce a product that exhibits fine-tuning, or whether this happened by chance. Andre Linde recently published a paper suggesting that there are 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 7 universes in this multiverse landscape as a product of slow-roll inflation. We know at least one universe that exhibits life that may have been randomly produced, or this could be a product of gnomic necessity. However, there must be a strong case for gnomic necessity. It doesn't seem to be connected with any sense of logical or metaphysical necessity. A case would have to be made. The conclusion follows logically from the premises. This gets us to an extremely intelligent agent. Whether this is one universe or one universe or one amongst the sea of other universes in the multiverse landscape, the fine-tuning evidence must have an explanation. Thus, the evidence of the fine-tuning we observe, the values and constants and laws of nature, the initial conditions, the inflation field, Einstein's equations, and string theory itself, is much, much more likely under the hypothesis that there is a fine-tuning. Our third argument is the moral argument. Premise 1. There are objective, axiomatic moral facts that obtain. 2. Either the world alone or the world and a perfectly moral person best explain these facts. 3. It is the case that the world and a perfectly moral person best explain these facts. Therefore, the world and a perfectly moral person best explain these facts. In essence, it seems that there are objective moral facts, and this asks the question, what's the best explanation for these facts? Premise 1 assumes moral realism. Some actions really are objectively, morally abhorrent. By objective, I mean that the truth value of such moral facts are true regardless of whether anyone recognizes them to be so or not. For instance, raping and torturing children for pleasure is wrong. The massacre here on campus, which took place nearly 5 years ago, was utterly wicked and evil, a tragedy. Teenage girls being trafficked around the world for sex is abominable. One ought to love others. One ought not to rape and murder. Now, what is the best explanation for these facts? Well, there are two options for the best explanation. The first is the natural world alone. The world can account for certain moral facts, but natural explanations will ultimately be insufficient in explanatory scope and power. It does seem to be the case that the natural order can account for some things due to certain features of this world, such as the intersubjective moral agreement, satisfactions of morality, you feel good when you do good, creatures with cognitive, and affective capacities as ours, rational apprehension of moral truths, creatures with essential properties we have. The world is metaphysically rich and robust. Human social requirements and or motivation theory get the ball rolling, but it cannot account with complete sufficiency. Attempts to ground such axiomatic facts in socio-biological evolution will ultimately be inefficient. For an axiomatic fact to be objective, it must be true in all possible worlds. The fact must be necessary. If we were to rewind the film of evolution and allow it to play out again, it's certainly possible that natural selection acting on random mutations would create a different biological landscape from what we observe today. Additionally, purely naturalistic theories suffer the is-ought problem. Science can certainly tell us what is the case in the current state of affairs, but it cannot tell us what ought to be the case. Where do obligations come from? Deontology, or duty-based ethics, cannot be accounted for in a purely naturalistic axiology. If ought implies can, and one is naturally determined to act contrary to the ought, how proficient can such a view be in accounting for these facts? Also, attempts to ground deontic ethics in Platonic terms, merely affirms that these facts obtain, but it does not have any explanation or explanation power. In Sam Harris's recent books, The Moral Landscape and Free Will, he has attempted to redefine normative statements. He equates human well-being with the good, and that which does not contribute to the human well-being, not good. In the moral landscape, Harris states, questions about values are really questions about the well-being of conscious creatures. I want to develop a science of human flourishing. The problem here is equating human flourishing with the good. Why is that? Why not the well-being of cats, dogs, or sponges? Such attempts to ground objective axiomatic facts leaves one with speciesism, a bias and special treatment for the Homo sapiens sapiens species, and a suppression of other species. Certainly, science can account for how we come to know certain axiomatic facts, but it cannot account for their grounding. I'm not saying human well-being isn't good, since good categorically encompasses human well-being, but such an account for objective morality does not satisfy the demands of a robust axiology, namely the problem of deontology. Additionally, how could one know what increases the well-being of conscious creatures? This suffers the same problem as utilitarian ethics. Surely it could be the case that something dreadful, awful, and painful could produce something good in the future, especially if this is based on the pains of evolution. The problem is that something bad now may not have a good effect at the present. It may not be viewed as maximizing human well-being, and thus may be considered bad when it would really produce a long-term effect of the betterment of the species. There's no way of knowing. The other option is the world in conjunction with a morally perfect person. This world conjoined with a morally perfect person makes a fuller case and provides the best explanation of the fuller range of moral facts in need of explanation. Such an explanation describes a world that has a texture, depth, and thickness it does, and is able to exist in the first place because it was imbued with the value and meaning it does by this morally perfect person. It must be a person because a person, a mind, is the only thing that can issue imperatives. A combination of persons or social theory doesn't work because persons are equal in imperative actions. Thus, there must be a person that has the authority to issue such deontic imperatives and ground these moral facts. In conclusion, remember from the beginning that we are using an epistemic probability calculus. Each argument must be evaluated on its own grounds with the selected background information, K prime. That is, no other arguments are influencing them. They stand alone. Now, when we use these arguments in a cumulative case, we are left with a spaceless, timeless, transcendent, uncaused, very intelligent, morally perfect person. This is sufficient for theism. Each of these evidences are much, much more likely under the hypothesis that God exists, and very, very unlikely under the hypothesis that God does not exist. Given the total background knowledge K in this cumulative case, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, it is more probable that God exists than not.
Could not be otherwise. So you brought up this issue about fine-tuning. This is about multiverses. Quite likely, we don't know enough about the physics that we do have to know how things would be different if we had different laws of physics. In my talk, I'm not going to focus on overly speculative physics or cosmology. In 423 BC, Aristophanes wrote a comedic play called The Clouds. It featured the famed philosopher Socrates arguing against the existence of Zeus. Responding to the claim that Zeus was a god, Socrates responds, "Zeus? What Zeus? Are you mad? There's no Zeus." His opponent, Strepsiades, asks him, "Who then makes the rain?" Zeus responds that it's the clouds that make it rain. Who decides what or who gets struck by lightning? No one, is the response. Lightning seems to be uncaring, striking the just and the unjust with equal efficiency. Scientists are able to explain nature without having to invoke the supernatural. It is important to understand this was not always the way that science worked. Rather, it is simply the naturalist has been shown to be the most effective strategy for research after thousands of years of trial and error. It used to be that God figured into scientific explanations. Newton, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, they all believed that by exploring the natural order of the cosmos, they were illuminating the mind of God. However, throughout all of this time, throughout the entire development of modern science, God has never been found to be a useful hypothesis. This sort of thought was epitomized in events in the early 19th century, famously reported by Victor Hugo. Mathematician Laplace presented his work to Napoleon, who promptly replied, "How can this be? You made the system of the world, you explain the laws of creation, but in all of your book, you speak not once of the existence of God." Laplace said to reply, "I had no need of that hypothesis." And so it has been since. But what about the origins of the universe, you might protest? Where did everything come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? There are many independent lines of research my colleagues are currently developing to answer just this question. But whatever scientific theory turns out to be correct, we should not expect it to be a story that semi-literate go-getters constructed in a massively undeveloped part of the world a few thousand years ago. There have been no instances in which any such group of people have been shown to produce knowledge that exceeds the best science that we have today. There is a reason that 90% of the National Academy of Sciences are non-believers in some form or another. It's true that you can find scientists who believe in God, but people are quite capable of carrying contradictory beliefs. No one should conclude from the fact that some Catholic priests are child molesters that are abusing children is consistent with Catholic doctrine. Likewise, no one should conclude that science and religion are compatible merely because some scientists are religious. Suppose if I tell you that I can fly. After realizing that I was serious, you'd probably ask for proof. "Show me that you can fly," you'd say. And of course, if I then proceed to flap my arms and take off, you'd be instantly conquered. The same is true whenever I assert some extraordinary claim, especially one which is different from things you've seen in the past. If God is ordinary kinds of things, in the sense of people having boyfriends and girlfriends are ordinary, then saying that your God exists wouldn't be such an extraordinary thing. In fact, it would be rather banal. But if your God does exist, it's not that kind of thing at all. It's certainly not obvious to many of us that your God does exist. If it were self-evident or obvious, it wouldn't be the case that Christianity only accounts for 1/3 of the world's population. Or, again, that 90% of the National Academy of Sciences are non-believers. I agree that there are many different kinds of mysteries about this world, including the origins of the universe or of morality. But we don't just want any kind of explanation. We want good explanations that further our progress in understanding things about the world. We don't just want another Zeus. We ask for ideas that we can test out and argue for. I'm not going to argue for any particular theory about the origin of morality. I think there are reasons to believe in an objective secular morality. But even if there were no such thing, that still wouldn't establish that God has to exist. I regard the origins of morality and whether or not there is an objective source for morality to be largely independent of the question of whether or not God exists. However, I will argue that the sort of God my opponents have in mind, the Abrahamic God, classical monotheism, cannot possibly be the source of what we normally regard as morality. We are told that without God, there would be no morality. Indeed, Dostoevsky once famously wrote that without God, all is permitted. However, examining Christian doctrine, one certainly finds quite the opposite. No matter how savage or brutal one may be, merely accepting Jesus into one's heart secures a place in heaven. Indeed, with God, all is permitted and nothing is forbidden, except, ladies and gentlemen, disbelief. If you merely disbelieve and thereby commit the sin of apostasy, you will have committed the greatest sin in the entirety of Christendom. The same is true of Islam, where apostasy warrants execution in addition to hellfire. Not only is one condemned to hell, but your neighbors will think you're getting there. The late Christopher Hitchens often challenged people to come to name for him a good deed that a religious person could do, but that an atheist could not. Apparently, this is a difficult task, and for all of his career debating this question, Hitchens was never rewarded with an answer. But now imagine the opposite. Can you name for me a wicked deed that a person could do because of religion, but which no person could do otherwise? For everyone here, it takes absolutely no time at all to provide an answer. You know right away the kinds of atrocities that have been committed because of all manner of religious convictions. Incidentally, it's not religion alone that is at fault here. What is at fault is dogmatic thinking. When you look freely and openly question whatever it may find to be in doubt, when faith is propped up above reason, that is the moment that opens the terrifying door. One way that people have done that sort of thing is with religion. But of course, people have done that sort of thing with political systems too. The atrocities of the Nazis, the communists, and various other totalitarian regimes are the product of systems where people are not free to be skeptical. Whether the issue is that of a doubting Thomas or political reformers, the end result is the same. How do we know when a doctrine is good or bad? We reject evil doctrines not because of the Word of God. After all, evil doctrines quite often proclaim themselves to be the Word of God. Rather, we reject evil doctrines because we know right from wrong, independently of religion. In Deuteronomy 22:11, God instructs us not to wear mixed fabrics. Yet all of us on this stage are wearing mixed fabrics. In 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 23 through 25, God sends bears to maul 42 children after they merely called a man bald. Is that morality? Why do we not force rapists to compensate the fathers of rape victims for the damaging of broken goods, as God commands in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 through 29? Why do we let women speak in public or in church or teach our children, as God instructs us not to do in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34? In Exodus chapter 21, verse 6, we are not only told that we can own slaves, but that should they wish to leave their enslavement, we should send them all through their ear into a door. Is that morality? Some of you might think yes, but this was the Old Testament. Jesus brought a new deal, a new covenant with God. But do you mean to tell me that it was once morally righteous to treat the woman as property to the extent that rapists merely needed to compensate their owners? That's Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 through 29. That after compensation was reached, the rapist would marry his victim as if he had broken an item at a store and was thereby forced to purchase it. What about killing not just the rapist or victim, but the woman as well, as punishment for being raped? That's Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 23 to 24. Or that at some point, an unchanging and eternal God could be infatuated with the smell of burnt flesh, but is so no longer. No, we recognize those things as simply immoral. And would you tell me that the God of the past is somehow less moral than the God who exists today, in spite of his timeless nature? Or would you give me the rather banal explanation that this is precisely the kind of mythology that one expects from Bronze and Iron Age peoples, consistent with, and comparable to other texts from the same time period. Whatever it is that explains morality, it's certainly not God. And more than definitely, not the God that my opponents believe in. But what of other gods? The variety of God concepts the world over is so diverse that you can hardly think it useful to use the same word to describe all of them. The Christian God is supposed to be omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent, and omnipotent. But examine the Greek gods. These beings escalate more drama than most soap operas. They are far from morally perfect. They are subject to the meta-divine force of fate, just as mortals are, and they engage in intercourse with humans. The Greek gods are morally heavily flawed immortal superhumans, and they are like the Christian conception of God. In Tibetan Buddhism, there is a belief in gods, but those gods are not even immortal. They too are bound in samsara, fated to be reincarnated until reaching nirvana. In fact, before becoming enlightened beings and thereby entering nirvana, they must first be reborn as humans. In that sense, for the Tibetan Buddhists, humans have an advantage over the gods. But this is just an example. Most conceptions of things that have been called gods are so unlike the conception we have in the Western world that I doubt it's really an appropriate use of language to say that any of these beings are any form of God at all. I will therefore assume that I am arguing against what has been called the Abrahamic God. This is the conception of God in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Of course, the Abrahamic conception historically began with Judaism, to which I now turn. The Hebrew Bible certainly contains a narrative account of the origins of Abrahamic monotheism. However, without having first accepted certain claims about God to be true, we cannot trust the Bible to be the Word of God, the very being whose existence is on trial. Instead, we need to first examine the Hebrew Bible as a cultural artifact. In so doing, we need to examine that text in light of the relevant archaeological data, our independent understanding of ancient languages, and anthropological data developing human ideas, ancient and modern. All of this needs to be taken jointly with our knowledge of other ancient texts, which were likely produced in a similar cultural context. Of course, this is much too ambitious to do in the remaining time. Luckily, academics have done this examination and are led to several intriguing conclusions. I will proceed in summarizing these. The Hebrew Bible was produced in the 1st and 2nd millennia BC, was largely written in Hebrew, and contains myriad styles of writing. These myriad styles are most likely to the fact the single authorship was largely unheard of in early 1st millennium Israel. The Hebrew Bible is best seen as an amalgamation of various cultural works over a period of about 1,500 years. There is a diversity of ideas present, even different considerations about the afterlife. As an example, the primary author of Ecclesiastes seems to be largely agnostic to what happens after death. Indeed, the sort of whimsical musings about life in Ecclesiastes seem to have more in common with present-day humanists than with my opponents. The Hebrew Bible is composed as a sort of patchwork, and if you know enough about the relevant linguistics and cultural context, this becomes overwhelmingly obvious. In fact, it's one of the most parsimonious ways of clarifying the large number of contradictions and the use of multiple dialects of Hebrew, sometimes in the same sections. Archaeological data reveals that the Exodus story, where Moses led the Jews out of Egypt, is most likely mythological. There is no evidence of Jewish slaves ever having been in Egypt, despite exhaustive evidence by both the Egyptians and their enemies. Even if the Egyptians were too proud of people to record the escape of so many slaves, their enemies surely would have kept such records. Nor is there evidence of the Jews having been in a desert for 40 years. Finally, in what we now call Israel, we simply see a smooth transition from the Canaanites into the Israelites. Religiously, one sees a transition from Canaanite polytheism through a period of monotheism, and finally into monotheism. In fact, examined in its original Hebrew, the Bible contains numerous references to polytheism. Often, these are polemics against the practice of polytheism, but instead of seeing this as a condemnation of their neighbors, archaeologists have realized that this is a polemic against the cultural practice within the context of early Judaism. that early Judaism formed out of the merging of many Canaanite deities into one, and subsequent fracturing with the old ways. This explains the emphasis on such matters in the Ten Commandments and other parts of Jewish law. And this is where we see the real emergence of Israelite monotheism, in the cultural evolution of the Canaanites. The clues to this evolution remain in the Hebrew Bible and in translation through to the Christian Bible. On these grounds, scholars have largely concluded that this conception of God is most likely a cultural construct, no different from the gods of the Canaanites from which Yahweh emerged. We can therefore conclude that God, most likely, does not exist. I will leave you with one last thought. To a theist, it was once remarked, I contend we are both atheists. I just believe in one God fewer than you. When you understand why you dismiss all the other possible gods, you will understand why I dismiss yours.
Great, and now we'll have Joshua.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say that it is a great pleasure to be here tonight. I'm very excited. I've been looking forward to it, and I'm very pleased with the turnout. I don't know how many people remember from the introductions, but my major is in international studies. And I'm a senior this year, which is nice, but I'm also an undergraduate. So I am distinguished from my competition and my team this evening in that I am the only person here who is not studying either philosophy or a hard science. And the two gentlemen here who are studying philosophy are more advanced in their studies. So hopefully it won't be obvious from the way that I debate or what I say, but it might be. But it's highly possible that this evening I'm in over my head. And unfortunately, it may be not only possible, but also likely that I am sharing a table this evening with my academic, intellectual, and philosophical betters. So you can take that one of two ways. Either, well, he's just another ignorant theist, which no disrespect to anyone involved, but there are plenty of those, and I've seen a lot of that. And that's caused a lot of frustration in my own heart, my own life. Or, you know, what I'm saying perhaps might have a broader appeal. If anybody has listened to what has been said so far and feels intimidated by the diction or the esoteric terminology, I'm right there with you. Have trouble. It might be an inconvenient time to admit that, but yeah, here we are. So, for me, but I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I'll get right to it. Again, please bear with me. I may be a little scattered. This is my first debate. But the biggest thing, the main point I'd like to start out with is to ask you all, why are you here? Maybe you're here to support me or Max or the gentleman from Free Thinkers. Maybe you want to see some ignorant theists get beat up on as easy game, which might happen. And if it does, then maybe we deserve it. So, whatever. Okay. Intellectually then. For me, I'm here, and this question struck my interest because I have spent a lot of my life trying to figure it out. Is there a God? Well, why does it matter? For me, it's always been apparent that, you know, we're all born. No one asked to be born. No one really knows where you came from. If you were born in Pakistan or Malaysia or in Virginia like I was, I mean, we didn't have any control of that. Like, we're here. We're here as people. If there is a material, non-supernatural cause for that, that has implications, and it has effects on individuals as people. What's your worldview going to be? What will your politics be? What are your views on all sorts of social issues? How are you going to live? We'll speak frankly this evening. I am turning 24 on Sunday. I'm reasonably good looking. I'm reasonably charismatic. I might not have the best social skills, but, you know, whatever. I'm a virgin. I'm not especially thrilled about that. Like, it's worth it to me, but, you know, I mean, my religion has cost me some things, and which is all fine and all worthwhile in the event that I'm right about that. But I was raised as a Christian. Perhaps a fair number of people in the audience were. But I would submit to you, and I hope you've already considered this, that's not a good reason to be a Christian. Christianity, like all religions, like all worldviews, like all perspectives, is an amalgamation, a conglomeration of different viewpoints, different ideas. It's a catch-all term of sorts. There is a widespread room for differences of theology, differences of belief, and they all matter. I mean, I've wrestled with all those questions that my opponent brought up, and wisely. What's offended me a lot of the time is people who have been in church with me as I've grown up, and they're not angry about the fact that, I don't remember, Dan, do you remember offhand, was it the prophet Nathan, or the man that was bald, and the children got bald for it?
It was Elijah. But I think it's the year asking me a Bible question.
Yeah. Case in point, case in point. I remember reading that story, and yeah, God had called Elisha to be a prophet and to speak for him and to replace Elijah as his successor. And so one day these children, while Elisha is traveling, see him and they start making fun of him because he's bald. And then God sends a bear out to maul him, and to maul the children, and they died. And like innocent children, what's the morality in that? I mean, there are so many. I don't know how the Quran is. I've read part of that, not that much. But as far as the Jewish texts, Christians share a lot of those texts as well. So the book of Leviticus, the book of Deuteronomy, the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those are all my holy texts as well. And there's so much that I don't understand. And there's so much that doesn't make sense. And there's so much that, to me, does not seem logical about any of that. And I've had a lot of anger about that. And it's upset me, just the intellectual sloth that I've seen in my peers, who are good people. You know, they're moral people. They're loving people. They've been good to me. They've been my best friends. They've been my family for, you know, the short life that I've had so far. But where do you get off thinking that just because you grow up believing something, it's okay to think that? That's what wars are fought over. That's why there's been genocide and all sorts of abuses from one man or one woman or one person to another. And no one's advocating that. And I hate that. And I hate the conflict that comes from that. And you should too. And I feel like if you are a Christian, which this is not about Christianity tonight, it's about theism versus atheism. But if you are a Christian, or if you are Muslim, or if you are somebody who believes in a higher power, I think you owe it to yourself and to everyone else, and you owe it to the skeptics and the critics to consider and work out for yourself why would a good God allow that? You know, why would this happen? How is this God's will? If God is real, why don't we simply see God? Why doesn't he simply appear and show himself to each of us individually? And that is a fantastic question, and that I've never had an answer for. You skipped from science to theology, you know, to metaphysics when you ask that question, but it's no less of a valid question for that. So before I digress too far, I'll return to some of these points, but I'd like to point out, my partner Max made some great points that I don't know if anyone else had trouble following. The concepts are simple. The terminology can be difficult, but the concepts are really very simple. And my opponents tonight, so far when they presented, really didn't answer any of that. What they did do, they did not address the moral argument, not in any great depth. They made a couple of assertions which they did not back up. They did not address the cosmological argument. What they did do was fall into a trap, Moshe. Based on what I've said already, I hope you see that I understand it's easy to fall into this trap. But what he's done is compare theology from different religions, theology from different Christians, one to another. And even a book like the Bible, I mean, I have spent a lot of time reading the Bible. I've read the whole Bible. There's a lot that, you know, you forget or a lot you don't understand. But it makes me angry. There's so much trying to understand it that, you know, I mean, there's a lot of good questions that come up, but there are a few ways, even within the scriptures, even if you were going to assume all of this is true and inerrant, and this is God's word, period, and this is all of God's word. Some questions can't be answered just by piecing together different verses. Hence, throughout history, throughout the millennia, all the variance in opinion, hence the conflict. So that's natural, and I understand that. But neither is that the question tonight. If Allah says that someone who steals should have one hand cut off, one foot cut off, you know, that's not the question tonight. The question is there a God? It is entirely possible that Max and I sit here this evening and we contend with the fact there is a God, but yet we have no accurate understanding of who or what he, she, they are. What is God? You know, maybe the Quran is right. If you're here and you're a Christian, have you considered that possibility seriously? For me, this is a relevant question because rather than being a virgin and spending time in church and praying, if there's no God, I would be a lot happier living differently. And moreover, and humor aside, if I've grown up believing the wrong thing about God, there are some Muslim friends here tonight, and if I misspeak anything, hopefully they can correct me. But as I understand it, the Quran is clear that anyone who joins partners with Allah will be companions of the hellfire. And I believe that's like Surah 5, I'm really not sure. But I promise it's in there, you can find it. And what the Quran means when it says join partners with Allah is if you say someone other than Allah, which means God, the one God in Arabic, you worship that person and esteem them along with God. Me as a Christian, I do that. I say there is God the Father in heaven. Jesus Christ was a literal man. He was a Jew. He lived and he died and he did rise again. And he is God himself as well. And I know that's complicated, but we're not here to discuss theology. But I mention all of this just to say that if I am wrong about my beliefs, or if any of us here are, I mean, it depends on which side you're on, who's absolutely right in the end, you could be in danger of eternal punishment. You could be in danger of hell. And are you really willing to risk that possibility to save or preserve your complacency? If you've grown up being taught something, whether you've been taught Islam, whether you've been taught Christianity, whether you're an atheist, what if there is a God and you're on the wrong side? So that's a question of an eternal perspective with eternal ramifications, and you should consider it. But if, against what I think is better judgment, if that question doesn't really bother you, go back to what I said before. Politics, the trajectory of individuals, groups, religions, nations, wars. Is one village of people or one nation going to have their men killed and their women and children taken as slaves and their wives raped and abused for the name of religion? Again, how many times has that happened in history? I hate that. I don't like that. This question matters. And I don't feel that when my opponents spoke, they addressed that question. What they did address was, yes, all the crap, all the garbage, all of the inconsistencies that history is replete with examples of. When people claim to speak for God or they claim to hear from Him, but then they do things that, just as a person, I'm not a philosopher, but that doesn't seem just, that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right that, there's times in the Bible where even I read it, and it seems like God shows favoritism to one person over another. Today, certain people of an Islamic background, not all Muslims, but certain people of an Islamic background commit suicide and kill other people who are innocent, if I'm right, or if my peers are right. But if those individuals are correct, those are people that have offended God. So we all know that there is conflict and that there's disagreement. And then there's a lot that's difficult to understand about this question and its ramifications. But neither is saying that going far enough. We all know that there are problems, but that doesn't mean there is no God. And just to go back and recap, touch briefly and not as eloquently on what my partner has already put forward. As I understand it, physics, like all sciences, is something that is in progress, it's evolving. And that's how it should be. You should never stop asking questions. You should never stop looking for more and greater truth. But as I understand it, one of the gentlemen that was going to debate tonight is a physics PhD, so I was a little upset that he would be here to speak and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but he's still in the audience. So, but as I understand it, Einstein's theory of relativity shows that time and space and matter, as best as we understand it, are all codependent, or they're all mutually dependent, which means that prior to there being matter in the universe, prior to there being space, you could not have time. So it seems illogical to say, what happened before time, but you sort of get to the point in your reasoning where not everything adds up. And that's true whichever side of the fence you're on about God. But either way, here we are. And to some degree or another, we understand the laws of physics, and we're continuing to explore that. And there's a vast amount that doesn't make sense or that we can't answer, but nobody these days really believes, and you guys can correct me on this, I really might be wrong, but my understanding is that the consensus among the scientific community is that it's not possible that the universe always existed, which is called the steady state theory. But we believe in the Big Bang, the universe, the stars, the planets, and even the laws of physics as we currently know them and understand them all had a point where they began. if that's true, if I'm not correct, if I'm not correct in saying these things, then, if I'm not incorrect in saying these things, it stands to reason then that here we are. And as far as we know, and as far as our understanding of physics goes, in general, you can't have not a material thing causing itself. So when you look for the origin of time, space, and matter, you have to look to something that is beyond time, beyond space, and beyond matter. It is possible, I suppose, that there are, countless other universes whose laws and physics are different than our own. But my question is, when people form their beliefs, no one almost ever is going to have an airtight case to believe anything. So you need to look at where does the preponderance of evidence lie. And my question is, when you look at the origins of the universe, like forget biology, forget evolution, forget the fossil record, how old is the Earth, whatever, all those things, how did the universe come into existence? For me, it seems that the most logical thing, not that it's airtight, where did God come from? Who can answer that? But what's the alternative to saying, well, God came and he's outside of time, he's outside of space, he's beyond the laws and physics and rationale that we can comprehend at the moment, which in no way am I saying don't continue to look. But you can either say that, or you can say, I don't know, there must be some scientific cause for it. But all of the science and all of the physics that we can explore and grapple with at the moment are contingent upon the very laws that we find in the universe. And that's the universe that we are seeking to find the explanation for. So perhaps I didn't word that very well, but what I'm saying is that the universe came into existence. We were using the laws of this universe, which is the only one we can't be sure of that it exists. And even those laws we don't understand fully, but we're trying to use all of that to look backwards and say, well, even though we don't have an explanation for it mathematically, astronomically, we don't think that there's a God. I think there is. I think that if you're honest with yourself, if you can step back from the pain emotionally, maybe that you have in your own life and that you have in your own heart, or the ways where the things that people say about God don't seem to line up or add up, I think it makes more sense. Now, if you're someone here who, if you're angry about the concept of God, or maybe you grew up in a Muslim home, or a Jewish home, or a Hindu home, and the religious beliefs have poisoned your life, or they've tainted you against them, that's fair, and I understand that. But all I'm asking is step back and try and view the material as objectively as you can. Regarding the moral argument, no one is ever saying that just because you're an atheist, or you are an atheist, or you're agnostic, no one's saying you can't be moral. Of course you can. And I believe in my theology, which is, it's secondary at this point. Theology is secondary. Yeah, I think God sees that. If you're an atheist, but you marry, a man or marry a woman, and you're faithful to your spouse, like, you're being moral. If you don't lie, yeah, I think you're being moral. No one's saying that you can't be an atheist and not be moral, but what they are saying, and what Max put forth rather eloquently and concisely, I think, is that there's no way to anchor a concept of morality without a moral lawgiver. Ultimately, if there is no God, then we are sort of at the top of the food chain. And this is where existentialism and existentialist thought comes in. If ultimately there's nobody that has a greater understanding of the way the universe works than man, then it is up to man, and therefore different men in different places at different times, to try and define morality. And then therefore, ultimately, morality always becomes subjective. You try and hinge it on utilitarianism, what's going to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And we live in a broken world, and I think, that's how it should be. In general, we should try and do the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and there's always going to be losers. We live in a broken world, but that's practicality. That's not morality. That's not ethics. If you try and ground morality in biology, as Richard Dawkins does, in The God Delusion, which I read and I did not find compelling, ultimately those explanations so far have not provided a sufficient explanation for it. If you are walking in and you're of the opinion that certain things are absolutely right and wrong, then you need to question, how do you know that? Is it not ultimately a product of your culture or of your time? And for some people, it could be the case that there is no absolute objective morality, which is okay. I'm not saying that is an airtight argument for God in itself, but if in your own mind you're convinced that there are absolute morals, you need to explore what are the foundations of those in my own life. And I know I only have a few minutes left. 2 minutes, okay. One thing that has given me a lot of trouble and a lot of problems in my own belief that there was a God is grappling with the suffering in the world around me. The only thing that I can say is that if you look at the Bible, the very stories in the Bible that cause me to be offended and not understand, it seems like God wasn't fair, or it seems like, that doesn't make sense, why would he do that? Like, that was, inconsistent. The very same book that says that also says that God's ways are above our ways, and that he is just. And maybe that's sufficient for you, maybe not. I think if you are a Christian, perhaps it could be. If you're not a Christian, then let me say this. If there is a God, or if there's no God, the world's a broken place, the strong rule the weak, the people that can do, and whatever they want to do, they do. And if other people get trampled along the way, well, then that's how it happens. And we as a society, we as a people, should strive to diminish that, because no one thinks that's a good thing. But if there is a God, the question arises, well, why would a good God allow us suffering? Why would a good God, permit this? And that's what theologians have wrestled with for centuries and millennia. And I would say probably since as long as there's been man. My response briefly is this. If there is a God that is powerful enough to create the universe and to create you, and smart enough to tune the universe the way Max has spoken very briefly about, and there's a lot more data you could explore that would astound you at the complexity that makes the simplest things happen, whether it's chemistry or biology, physics, whatever. But if there's a God that's wise and powerful enough to do that, it only makes sense that despite the suffering we see in the world, despite the hurt, God must be good. Because if he hated you, if there were a moral law, if there was any preference that he had about humanity and the way we think and act and live, he would crush you, he would destroy you, you would cease to exist, or existence would become something more akin to the Islamic or Christian concept of hell. That's what existence would be like. So if you woke up this morning and you have friends and you're alive, maybe you have health problems, like I do, but they're still good. The only thing that, I'll come back to this. The only thing that makes good is that if God really hated you, if God was anything other than good, then you wouldn't exist, or he would crush you and destroy you. Like, there would be no joy or pleasure in life. So all I'm saying is that the problem of suffering in the world is a problem, but it doesn't disprove the fact that there's a God, even that there's a good God.
I'd like to thank you, Josh, for making your speaker clear, because I did not follow Max's. Sorry. I would like to thank you, Josh, for making your argument very clear, because I didn't follow Max's like you did. That was way from my part. I think the physicists, the mathematicians, and the chemists in the room might have a problem with lumping biology into which part of science.
Really?
Oh, yeah. There's a definite hierarchy. Regarding the moral argument, I want to pose the question, are God's commands the source of morality? And if so, doesn't that then make them arbitrary? And if God's commands aren't the source, if he's merely drawing upon some other moral source, then the argument of morality doesn't even follow. I believe that you advanced a somewhat weak version of Pascal's wager at some point, which is not relevant to the existence of God at all. Pascal's wager being that it's better to believe in God because you may be damned with eternal hellfire if you don't. That there is no consequence on atheism for dying an unbeliever or a believer, yet there is a consequence on atheism or on Christianity for dying as an unbeliever. This is not relevant to the existence of God at all. So let me get into the meat of my presentation. On December 26, 2004, an earthquake in the Indian Ocean caused a tsunami that struck Southeast Asia. The waves reached towering heights of 98 feet and killed over 220,000 men, women, and children. Over 300,000 were killed in 2010 by the earthquake that left the country of Haiti a pile of rubble. 1 million were left without a home. In the United States, Hurricane Katrina killed over 1,800 people in 2006, flooding the streets with fetid, disgusting water, and leaving the city of New Orleans in a state of destruction from which it is yet to fully recover. Disasters of this magnitude strike randomly and often without warning, and the human misery caused by these events seems to be difficult to comprehend. There is no safety in either wealth or religiosity. As Time magazine asked in reference to Katrina, how then did we get here? How did the richest country on earth end up watching children cry for food in putrid encampments on the evening news? A similar question could be asked regarding the level of religious belief in America. Why would a country with such religious fervor be punished so severely by a just, caring God? These terrible events present a problem for an omniscient, and morally perfect being. A version of this problem, the problem of suffering or the problem of evil, was presented by the philosopher William L. Rowe as follows. 1. There exist instances of intense suffering which an omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or committing some evil equally bad or worse. 2. An omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without committing some evil equally bad or worse or losing some greater good. 3. Therefore, there does not exist an omniscient, wholly good being. It's not just singular events with disastrous effects that pose a problem for such a being. The very nature of humanity's origins as a species, the origins of every species to be more precise, is based on the environmental pressures that our ancestors faced. Everyone living today has a long line of ancestors back to the very first cell who have survived long enough to reproduce successfully. With every successful act of reproduction, random mutations may lead to traits that affect the fitness or ability to survive and reproduce of an organism. That there is a distinct species, Homo sapiens, is owed to the process of evolution by natural selection over billions of years. Almost no biologists doubt the veracity of evolution or the importance that natural selection plays in speciation. This alone tells us nothing about the truth of the proposition, but thankfully the evidence for natural selection is overwhelming. Since the development and widespread use of antibiotics, hospitals have seen increasing instances of resistant strains of pathogenic microbes. MRSA is a bacterial pathogen that is common in hospital settings where antibiotic use is most prevalent. HIV treatments show reduced efficacy after resistance builds up from the culling of those virions without the requisite genetic sequences that protect them from the drug treatment. White fur in animals is exceedingly rare in habitats full of greenery, where it provides poor camouflage from predators and prey, and more common in habitats of ice and snow, where such an adaptation is advantageous. The list goes on and on and on. It is easy for us to forget that we live in relative safety from the day-to-day operations of nature. Not many of us worry that a leopard might be lurking outside of our apartments, waiting to sever our spinal columns, carry our carcasses up a tree, and eat the flesh from our bones. This is a fact of the world we live in, however. It is a worry that was present with Homo sapiens on the order of only tens of thousands of years ago. Predators kill and eat prey. Organisms compete for scarce resources. There are winners and there are losers. There are a lot of losers, in fact. If it were otherwise, in many organisms, the vast majority of individuals will not survive long enough to reproduce. If it were otherwise, the world would be overrun with frogs. Those who don't have the biological tools to compete will die, often with intense pain and suffering. What does this tell us about whether God exists? Couldn't God be the architect of evolution? This process, whereby those organisms with adaptations survive and reproduce, and those without those adaptations die, poses an even deeper problem for an omniscient, and morally perfect being than a random disaster does. It seems that suffering is now not only a random occurrence, but is a natural feature in the structure of our origins, and the origins of all life around us. My argument from suffering can be stated as follows. 1. Gratuitous suffering and death is a feature of evolution by natural selection. 2. Evolution by natural selection is a process that exists. 3. If there is an omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect being who designed the universe, it would not do so in a manner that has a mechanism which features gratuitous suffering and death. 4. Therefore, an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect being who designed the universe does not exist. Wouldn't such a being, as many who doubt the truth of evolution still believe, simply create the world in a state that was morally equivalent in every pertinent way, without leaving a trail of misery on the road to humanity? The argument that the greater good of human consciousness and free will outweighs the evils of the process which created us then seems to fail on the omnipotence of God. The billions of years of evolutionary history that lead to Homo sapiens becomes, simply put, a gratuitous exhibition of evil. The problem of suffering that I've presented so far does not even rely on those evils perpetrated by humans on humans. War, genocide, rape, murder, bigotry, and oppression are all neatly answered by the theist with the assertion that God granted us free will. Although I tend toward determinism, in light of the fact that I'm grateful to all of you for choosing to attend this debate, I have decided to leave this assertion alone. The problems of suffering that I presented do not rely on any possibility of the will of human beings, only the will of the Creator, if such a being exists. I can almost hear the gears turning in the theist's head now. How can you know the will of the Creator? God works in mysterious ways. This argument just seems bizarre to me. By asserting that God is omnibenevolent, morally perfect, or all good, the theist himself is claiming to know the will of the Creator. This may be counterproductive, and let my fellow theists forgive me, but let me suggest that in addition to asserting that God is maximally powerful, maximally knowledgeable, and maximally good, the theist should add the additional quality of being maximally obtuse. The moral perfection of God is not my assertion, by the way, even though it is a characteristic that I've relied on for my arguments thus far. On my position, I simply fail to see any good reason to believe that he, she, shklee, or shklur exists. It has apparently become unpalatable for modern theists to accept the possibility that their deity is not omnibenevolent. Those with even a passing familiarity with Greek myth will note the God concept has not always carried such connotations. The Olympic pantheon had more in common with characters from Gossip Girl than anything to do with Yahweh. If you will forgive me, I will take a slight tangent, but I promise that I will bring it back fairly quickly. I should say now that I presented the materialistic view as being one that is wholly negative. In my ambition to argue against the existence of God, I have made the case that the universe is an awful place full of misery and suffering on a scale that is incomprehensible, and that the natural world does not care one iota what affects humanity. These are truths it seems that we must accept if we take the atheistic position. I am quoting now from Max's law. If there is no God to provide meaning, value, and purpose, the only consistent option for humanity is suicide. Any becoming of life-affirming or life-denying acts are illusory. Absolutely nothing can be positive or negative act for the individual, since there is nothing to determine a differentiation. One is forced to face Nietzsche's abyss and face the reality that no rope can scale the depths of nothingness. One is only left with despair, guilt, and angst. If one can determine that despair, guilt, and angst are not preferred, then his only option is to eliminate such emotions and thought. If there is no God, the only remedy for absurdism is to participate in Nietzsche's abyss of nothingness, suicide. There's just more to it, though. There's a reason we sometimes forget the indifference we see in the world around us. It is with each other that we can make the world a better place. We care about each other. There's happiness, there's connection, not in a spiritual sense, but with one another. A joke among friends, a kiss, art, music, a good story, sex. All of these are just as joyous and inspirational on atheism. These are just a few of many reasons that we could call upon to find inspiration not to kill ourselves. We should believe that either we accept the existence of God or commit suicide. That there are two atheists debating on the stage the evidence that the illusory, even if we accept it as such, can be enough to continue existing. It is a separation from the cold, callous natural world that allows us to experience the things that make life worth living. Probably no one has ever composed a symphony while running from a bear. It is by understanding the natural world that we can separate ourselves from its negative characters. As it was to Newton, who called upon God to explain his inability to model the motion of our planets around the sun, a model later supplied by Laplace, whom Dan has already stated, had no such need for such a hypothesis. Believing God is an impediment to such understanding. Theism leaves us with no direction in our search. When you hear that the beginning of the universe must be caused by God, because we can't comprehend an infinite regress, this shouldn't just give you pause, it should make you angry. It wasn't believing God that got us to the point where we even had any evidence that the universe did have a beginning. It wasn't believing God that modeled the motion of planets. It wasn't believing God that gave us effective medicine. It was the collective scientific work of the ingenious and intrepid men and women who supplied hypotheses that did not require the supernatural. God has always existed within the gaps of human knowledge, within those murky areas where evidence has yet to either be collected or explained. Hypotheses relying on God have never led us to any deeper understanding of the world around us. It is almost a functional equivalent of saying, I don't know, except that saying, I don't know, allows those among us who have the capabilities to tackle such problems, unnatural explanations, a reason for doing so. Until such a time that the God hypothesis provides the best explanation for some evidence, such that further inquiries based on that hypothesis lead to even better understanding of some phenomenon, the utter impotence that God provides us with regarding our quest for understanding of the world should be taken as further evidence that probably God does not exist. Thank you.
So at this time, we have a couple of microphones open, and we would invite folks to come up and query the panel. I might insert a word at this point. I would give the panelists about a B or B minus as far as mutual respect. Let's see if we can do better, because rationality is partly a function of not just intellectual ability, but also emotional regulation. So with that, if anybody would like to come forward with questions.
Can I just go ahead and speak? Just during the whole debate, I could not help but think from the fact that within formal debates, when a idea is presented, the objective of the opponent is to either nullify one of the hypotheses of the argument, or to at least present. Actually, no, that's the whole purpose. And with the arguments that Max presented, there was no nullification of what he gave. His argument was that God probably exists. And he did so by saying that, there's a network of causally dependent contingent things, and so they must, be a first cause in a network of continued causes. But you gave no first cause or any reason for why there should not be a first cause. Also, given the fine-tuning argument and the conclusion there presented, therefore, the life-promoting universe or multiverse strongly supports fine-tuner over non-fine-tuner. You gave no reasons as to why there should not be a fine-tuner. The argument was not that God is that fine-tuner necessarily, but just there must be a fine-tuner, which it does happen to be that he believes it is God, and that God probably exists, but that was not the argument. Also, I couldn't help but notice, and just wanted to throw the idea out, on your laptop, you have a sticker that says coexist. Your sister suggests that all things should coexist. If this is the case, this is something that I've struggled with, personally being a Christian. If it is the case that, as your sticker suggests, all things should coexist, then why argue to defeat a cause that has no lasting effects as you believe, in favor of a belief that has no lasting effects, if it is the case that there is no God and all there is science. If you are right, then defeating them has no lasting purpose other than to say you were wrong. If, however, Christianity is right, then there are some very serious implications.
Right, so I'll take those in reverse order. So the last thing you noted there was apparently beliefs don't have consequences other than apparently that if I'm right, then I'm going to beat my opponent's debate, whatever that would mean, because I'm looking for score really. But if I were to convince people, for example, that I was right, then on your view, there would be no real consequences, and I could dance up and down or something. And that if my opponents are right, or that if Christianity is true, then there are dire consequences. Well, so that's Pascal's wager, which we've argued before. The response, there's a few responses we can give to it, but I'll just give one brief response, and that's this. So there are at least two religions out there that claim that non-believers get to be punished after death. That's Christianity and Islam. Now, Christians, at least most Christians, so the traditional Orthodox doctrine is that Orthodox, it's a Greek Orthodox, but Orthodox in the sense of traditional doctrine for Christianity is that if you are a non-Christian, then virtue of the fact that you have not been saved, you will go to hell. The same thing, or a very similar thing, is true in Islam, where traditionally it is believed that you will be cast into hell. Now this argument, Pascal's wager, can't really decide between these two cases, because both of those have the same consequence. In fact, we can do even worse. We can imagine that there is a deity, who perhaps we can name Fred, who will actually punish us for believing things for which there is either no evidence or improper kinds of evidence, things like that. Not only should you not believe in Fred, if that's the case, but because of the potential consequences of believing in other kinds of gods for which there is the same kind of evidence under certain kinds of views, then he would punish you as well. If you actually thought of this for a while, you realized that this brings you to a standstill, that the kind of decision based upon the consequences in the afterlife for these beliefs don't do anything. As far as the coexist sticker, my view on this is that it would be nice if we could somehow get religions to almost universally mutate into things that acted as intellectual opinions do today, that people come together for discussions like this one, and that we don't have religious-based violence. This also includes the rejection of doctrines that involve forcing people to hate, which is one of the reasons, precisely why beliefs are important to question, because beliefs have consequences. Now, having consequences more than just in the afterlife, right? Because your actions, what you do today or tomorrow or whenever, is determined in part by your beliefs. So if you think that the morally correct thing for you to do is to blow up this debate because perhaps you think it's heretical to have a debate of this kind, that's a negative consequence of that kind of belief. To argue against, to give you a response, since you wanted me to talk about Max's arguments, I'm going to give you two responses to those, and then we're going to take the next question. This is a bit long. As far as the fine-tuning argument, well, we don't know very much about the laws of physics as they are, nor do we know what it would be like if they were different. Moreover, we don't know what it would be like, or what kinds of universes would be produced if they were different, or what kinds of universes sentient creatures who could ask this sort of question would obtain. So that if the laws of physics were, for instance, different, the numbers were different, the constants you talked about were different, One might suppose that there would be other sorts of sentient creatures here in our place, asking why the constants turned out to be that particular way. The other thing is that those constants, we don't know where they come from, and for all we know, there might only be very particular values that they could have been. It might, under the models that you presented, there are various kinds of values those constants can take on, but we don't know that that's the ultimate story. And until we do, we have no reason to suspect that those numbers couldn't have been set by something other than God. As far as the cosmological argument, I see no reason why we can't have infinite regresses. I see no reason why, given a sequence of events, the fact that each of those events have antecedent causes couldn't simply explain those events. That's something called the Hume-Edwards principle, if you want to Google that. I also don't see why, and Josh actually points this out, why doesn't God need a maker? Or if you want to say that God is some kind of necessary non-contingent being, as Max wants us to believe, why it is that God should have that property and not some other kind of thing. So I think that's yeah, that's what I was about to say actually. So go on to the next question.
Hi, I had a question for Max actually on this theory, and you probably thought this through, and I was just curious about. So in part 2, you said a network of causally dependent contingent things cannot be infinite, and then basically if it's not infinite, it must be finite, and if it's finite, then there must be a fine tuner because then the set would be closed and bounded. However, why cannot be infinite? Because what I think you're describing here is a Markov chain, and Markov chain does not necessarily have to be finite set.
Okay. Well, perhaps an illustration of a train will help, with the boxcars being such sets and the whole train being the whole set, or power sets, whatever. With this model, even if you have an infinite set of boxcars, we already know that movement and causation is already occurring. Even if you have an infinite set of boxcars, an infinite set of anything does not actualize movement. So you have the potentiality of movement with these boxcars, but it doesn't get anything going. Even if you were to take the caboose and wrap it around to the first boxcar, there's no movement outside of the locomotive. And so it's a transitive network of causation.
Okay. Okay. How do you know that if it's that this infinite set that you're dealing with? I think you're dealing with real numbers here because you're dealing with boxcars. An infinite set does not necessarily have to be closed, right? Because it could be on a real number line between 2 and 3. So how do you know that what you're dealing with are boxcars? How do you know it's not all the little values between, say, 2 and 3?
I'm not quite sure where the analogy is fitting, but if maybe the distinction between the causes in the area and the causes in S, if it refers to the in-S causation, the essence or being of causation, that certainly not be actually infinite. But say that if it's open or if it's in process of causation, it's coming to fruition, that can be an actual infinite, but that's not what the argument is concerned about. So you can have surely an actual infinite set of contingencies, but the causes are not in S, essence or being, but the causes are in process.
So I encourage all of you to bug these people out. Yes.
On your handout sheets, you got 3 basic arguments of the debating which one to address. On the fine-tuning argument, there's an argument that I read once also, we can build mathematical models that more or less fit the universe we see, and then we can twiddle the math and change the constants and so forth, and imagine thereby, imagine with great mathematical precision, imagine other universes where the rules work differently, and stars do not form, or the universe does not expand, or whatever. The problem is that because we can imagine other universes, this is not evidence that any other universes are actually possible or if they exist. So it really, the fact that we can imagine all of the universes doesn't really say anything about probability. It's just, we don't know that the probability does not apply. And the fine-tuning argument depends on the premise that the universe we see is desperately unlikely, and you don't get that premise. On the moral argument, so many things wrong with it.
Why don't you limit yourself?
Okay, I'll leave it.
One, okay.
I had anticipated this objection based off of whether or not this was an appropriate random sampling. Also, whether or not there is a multiverse or not. Whether or not there is a multiverse, the question of single universe fine-tuning still has to be accounted for. But as far as whether this is an appropriate random sampling, if our natural laws have counterfactuals that are in any way coherent, that this would be an appropriate sampling. Also, to make this objection and advocate fine-tuning, or to advocate that the multiverse is an appropriate response to fine-tuning, those two cards can't be played. That was the card that was played, but you can't make an appeal to the multiverse as a selection effect for the universe, and then claim that this is an inappropriate random sampling. So if our laws do have any sense of coherent counterfactuals, then yes, this would be an appropriate sampling.
Alright, I'm going to try to do three things very briefly. The first of which is to apologize to you two, because I feel like you walked into a den of wolves without realizing it, and I am one of them, so I just like to apologize in advance. The second is to thank you for showing up and actually speaking. And third is to ask two questions, one to each of you, which I'm going to try to phrase in the form of yes or no, so you don't necessarily have to expand on them unless you want to. Josh, the question for you was, you mentioned Muslim suicide bombers and then said something about correctness of belief. I think I lost track. Are you saying that if Muslim theology, if their particular Muslim theology is correct, that of the suicide bombers, then their suicide bombing is justified, is morally correct? And one for Max is, oh, I'm a little really stupid if I can't remember yours. You mentioned something in your moral argument during your first session about the speciesism. It would arise in species. My question is that within the moral landscape, I'd like you to imagine two possible scenarios. One is a eventual civilization where human society is maximized, is morally perfect, and another where it is also morally perfect, but there are elephants. And I'd like to ask you which one is better for the human condition. Is the one with elephants better? Yes or no?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
So Sam Harrison's book defines morality as human well-being. Is that correct? My question for you is, then, are humans better off in a society where morality is defined in the interaction between humans themselves as maximized, but with animal and other forms of life added to it? I'm asking you if that universe is morally better if you define morality, according to Sam Harris, as the maximization of human well-being.
I'm not advocating Sam Harris's morality, and one of my critiques with that was that as far as what we can know as what is good or bad. But the problem with this is that I don't know how anyone would answer that question in the sense of why elephants and how does that contribute to moral well-being. There's so many states of affairs prior to it, leading up to it, and that would influence
respond to that with 1 second. I think what Harris would say in his defense is that we would answer any other scientific question that's contingent upon the evidence that is available to us at the present time. That what we do is we don't claim to know absolutely what is right or wrong, though we try to approximate it by gathering evidence and testing hypotheses about what it is that promotes the well-being of sentient creatures.
Joe, thanks for coming out. What was your question to me was, could you recap for me real quick?
Yeah, you said something about Muslim suicide bombers, and
Yes.
something in regards to their theology and my involved. I'm asking you if the theology of the suicide bombers is correct. If their God, the one they believe in Israel, and they ordered them to perform this action, which they then carry out, are they morally justified in doing so?
I want you, when I answer, to pay attention to all it is. But if all of that is true, then yes, of course it would be. Like, if you knew for a fact there is a God, if you knew for a fact this is what God says, then you, again, would have to do it, and that would be just. And, but of course the question is always, and that's not the same thing, I have a lot of Muslim friends who love to sit and talk about theology with me. None of them have ever tried to kill me. So the question that arises, are those people who perpetrate such acts, is their theology correct? So you can take that in one of two ways. You can define theological correctness as in what is actually true about God or God's whatever exists. Like, it's like a one-to-one ratio of a statement to actual truth. You can look at it another way. Biblical theology, obviously, there's room for differences of opinion on some things. For some things, it's pretty airtight. So, I mean, people might dispute, like, is alcohol okay for Christians or is it not? It's not always easy to tell just within, if you're going to take for granted that, like, this is our text, this is what we trust in the case of the Bible, then some things could still be correct or incorrect theologically, regardless of whether or not the Bible is actually true. So there's two levels to that. But I think that what you mean is, like, if there was a God and God said, you need to strap a bomb on and go kill somebody, like, if Jesus appeared to me today and said that, then, I mean, yeah, you should. And as vulgar as that sounds, number one, bear in mind, that's not what I'm advocating, it's not what I think. I don't think the Quran really even says that. But if, for the sake of argument, there is a God who established the world, established the universe, and he is the source of moral law, then by definition, what he says and what he commands is going to be moral. Again, for the umpteenth time to reiterate, I'm not saying that God wants that. I want everybody to be clear on that. But yes, basically, whatever God commands is just, is my opinion.
Yeah, I'm going to allow the elderly gentleman to go before me, but I would like to make one quick statement before that. The fact that you might rationalize suicide bombing in any case is proof in case of the dangerousness of belief.
See me out.
I just wanted to ask a question about evolution. It seems to be so much confusion. He seems to have all right educated. I'm an old country boy. I'm a student of life. And evolution isn't anything that Darwin invented. He
Unfortunately, I believe I'm the only one up here. But yes, sir.
Did you ever have a nocturnal commission?
With respect, sir, does it pertain to the question of whether or not there's a God?
I think we can probably get that question. I believe that's not an appropriate question. Sir.
Well, I'd like to say, first of all, that I wish more theists were like you, that is intelligent and accepting of other people's beliefs. But the reality is that that is not the case in the world and in this country. You said, Joshua, that you don't believe that atheists can be moral, as in you believe that atheists can be moral. But numerous studies have shown that the general American population regards atheists as less trustworthy than rapists and criminals. So that is kind of view held by the majority of theists. I would contend that both of you are a minority of the majority, and that you should keep that in mind when making claims and debates such as this. I'd also like to say that had this debate occurred several hundred years or even several thousand years ago, under many religions, Christianity included, myself and probably many other guests, as well as my panelists opposite me, would probably be taken outside and killed. Because we didn't believe, again, pointing out the dangerousness of belief by itself, regardless of anything else. That takes me to my question. Now, you said that, Max. You said that there has to be a sort of definitive morality, something that is wholly moral. Many theists, many Christians, I should say specifically, use the Bible as that. Now, the Bible, in addition to many other moral teachings, says about women multiple times that, in effect, that their worth is for linked to their virginity, and as was alluded to, raping takes away that virginity, and they become useless, and that is why, among other things, the rapists are forced to marry them so that they do not become alone and destitute. My question is, aside from that argument, aside from any biblical argument, do you believe there is a moral case why raping is bad?
A moral case for why raping is bad?
Yes.
Yes. Outside of the body?
Yes.
Well, yes, the way that I constructed the moral argument is that I granted that there were a lot of natural ways that we can account for morality, and I, defending the first premise of moral realism, said that one ought not to rape and murder. Aside from the biblical issues, those are questions about inerrancy. Those are any doctrinal questions that Dan brought up. Those are that in order for that to be relevant to this discussion, you would have to make the case, even for morality, that the inerrancy of the Bible is a necessary condition for the existence of God. And so, questions about inerrancy, what God had commanded in the Bible, those are secondary. It's not any relevant to the existence of God. But yeah, I think it's a moral intuition that rape is wrong.
Well, then I wish you would tell more people, because people keep telling me that I can't have morals because I'm an atheist. So.
No, I think that's one of the cases for the natural order of our cognitive and effective intersubjective moral agreements. And so, yeah, I'm completely confident.
I just wish more Americans also could they have.
Yeah, the main thing I forgot. One of the environment controls everything in life. When you change the environment, you change life. Well, if it changes too quickly, life cannot change. The dinosaurs changed so quickly, I don't know how long it took them to violence out. And the only solution to the violence is law and order. And get the damn guns out of the streets.
Joshua is my teacher, English teacher, so I have that language. So first I can answer for your question about earthquakes. Some people or a lot of people die. This is I am geoscientist or interested in geosciences. There is in our science there is earthquake, belt, and this is nature. Like for example, if there volcano, you can't building your home on the top of volcano. So identify people live on the earthquake belt. San Francisco is on the big faults, or so many earthquakes on San Francisco. Another things, every life of our or animal have end of life, and there is death, and this is normal things. My question is, what can happen for our planet if our temperature or the temperature increase 100 degrees? Although the temperature of surface temperature of sun is 5 million degree, who is control on this temperature? I think the nature of our planet here doesn't care about this temperature to be as a state or constant temperature for to our life or animal life or anything life in this planet. My answer, I think there is already there is God keep our life to be safe, and anything happen like death in events like earthquakes or other. This is nature. I think this is better for our life. Another thing, why the accuracy of time, there is certain time each day, each month, each year. I think we our Earth created from 4,500 from million years, and this is constant, and accuracy of this time is still constant. Who control on all of this? The last thing I can ask anyone here why he exists on the earth, why we all are live in our religion, because I am Muslim. There is some things to live it or created or and we are believe about revolution and the creation. These two things happen in or believe in our religion. And thank you. I can yeah. Thank you for thank you.
I believe the question was raised why we exist. I'm not sure that this answers the question, but I'm here today because my ancestors were successfully able to reach the age of sexual reproduction, sexually reproduced, and eventually this led to my parents, who did that 26 years ago, and that's why I exist. Presumably that's why I'm exist.
So it seems like you started out
why aren't we looking at the fact that God began in our ignorance, in our infancy, and that was the only place that we've ever had them constructed since. We have never had a science produce a God. It's only ever been in our ignorance that we've made one.
I think that God has made, as a Christian, I believe that there's been the revelation through the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, and his resurrection affirms his divinity. That's the case that we've not been made, but it's a convention, sure we can discuss it. But we're not using a God over gaps argument here, and we're not using God as a scientific hypothesis. We are arriving at the same conclusions, and I'd be more than happy to settle with the same scientific conclusions that these gentlemen are wrestling to, but we're just asking metaphysical questions that follow. Why? Why is this here? How does it work? More along those lines, or how did I get here? These are philosophical questions that, yes, we don't treat God, or I don't think we should treat God as a scientific hypothesis, because it's a metaphysical question. And God is an agent or entity that sure you can't put under a microscope. There's no problem with that. But I would also argue that by that revelation of Jesus, that we don't come to infer God's existence based out of ignorance. That may have been a historical assumption, but if you want to make that claim, then that would just be an anachronistic fallacy of assuming something in the past and applying that to something now. So I don't think that's the case here. I think that we have, I presented adaptive arguments saying that these are the best explanations of it. So it's not really that we can't explain, but they are the best.
Take one more question.
Hey, just for I'd like to read a quote about the reaction or the thoughts of the deists. Because there are a lot of things, personally I'm an atheist, there are a lot of things that have pushed me in that direction. But a lot of the arguments I found to rely on some assumptions that I'm willing to make, but a lot of deists aren't. There's one quote that I find very foolproof that's given us to me, and I want to see what you guys think. It's by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Live a good life. If there are gods and they are just, then they will not care how devout you have been, but will welcome you based on the virtues you have lived by. If there are gods but unjust, then you should not want to worship them. If there are no gods, then you will be gone, but will have lived a noble life that will live on in memories of your loved ones. So if you guys agree with that, then are atheists. If you disagree, can you
Yeah, well, I'm not a scholar, but all I can say is I agree with Marcus Aurelius. I think those are all great points. But all he does is he throws forth the assertion, like, if there are equal gods, which, I mean, I can speak with anybody afterwards if they want to take, like, time to do that. I don't think that's logical. If there's no God, then hey, there's still benefits to living morally. And, you know, if you give money to poor people, if everyone in society did that, a lot of major religions advocate that. Of course, the world would be problem. And yeah, when you die, you will be better remembered. So even if there's no God, there is value in morality. But again, the fact that there's equal gods, that just doesn't make sense to me. So I'm just going to discard that, and we can talk about it. But if there is a God, and you're devout, and you do good works, and you do good deeds, I mean, I think God sees that and recognizes that, no matter by what name you call him. And there's limits to this. I'm not trying to come off as like a pure pluralist or whatever. But I mean, hey, if I'm wrong about what I think God is someone other than who I think he is, still, I mean, I think that he'll look on me favorably for the good things that I do. And of course, if I'm right, I'm going to know that. He's only means proud. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with Marcus Aurelius, essentially.
And can you justify basically saying, I mean, I think your response. I'll tell you later.
Yeah, afterward.
Let's thank our panel.